program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the City of Eau Claire. This program is simulcast on WRFP-LP 101.9 FM.
Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. My announcement at the beginning here will be a little briefer. We actually don't have any items for public hearing today. This is all public discussion. Should be a fairly short meeting, I think. But the meeting is being broadcast live by Valley Media Works on Charter Channel 994, WRFP-LP 101.9 FM, and online at valleymediaworks.org. And with that brief introduction, we will begin with item 1, which is a public discussion for recommendation to the City Council regarding an annex of W3380 State Road Highway 37, Little Red School. Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Chairperson Larson and members of the Commission. Again, before you this evening is a request to annex land owned by and lying near, but not necessarily contiguous to, the City of Eau Claire, located on the north side of Highway 37, shown here, and west of Taylor Creek, at W3380 State Road 37, so Highway 37. The applicant is the City of Eau Claire. The property owner is both the City of Eau Claire and what is now a predecessor to the current Eau Claire Area School District. The property itself is about 33.79 acres in size. It does include, at the southwest corner, what is known as the Little Red School. The existing land use is vacant for the majority, again, plus the Little Red School itself. The proposed land use is intended to remain the same. Existing zoning is in the town of Brunswick, and the proposed zoning would be to that of P public zoning. The recommendation, staff does recommend approval of the annexation. The item will be considered by the City Council at their meeting next week. Again, this property is home to the former Little Red School. Section 66.0223 of Wisconsin statutes allows for non-contiguous city-owned property to be annexed to the city, and that is the case here with this property as well. Property, again, is in joint public ownership by both the City of Eau Claire and that predecessor to the Eau Claire Area School District. The Eau Claire Area School District Board formally recommended approval of the annexation request back at its April 1st meeting. No land use changes are proposed at this time as a result of the requested annexation. The request is consistent with the comprehensive plan as well. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Any questions? Commissioner Peterson.
How did the city come to acquire joint ownership of this property?
Very good question. I don't have the full history in front of me, but it basically points back to long ago that there was a time when Eau Claire City School District coexisted with the City of Eau Claire itself back in 1982. That was then modified by state legislature, and all budgets and property and such was supposed to be essentially moved strictly over to the school board itself, and the school district was then essentially disconnected, for lack of a better term, from the City of Eau Claire itself. So this, at that time, this along with other properties in that joint ownership were then essentially cleaned up. This was one that has remained since then. And so this is part of that formal cleanup as reported by the Leader Telegram over the weekend, again, kind of based on comments made by the school district representatives. There has been more interest in perhaps discussing potential uses of the property, even just renting and utilizing it temporarily or part-time. And that led to some records search and determination that this is one of the properties that has never been formally disconnected. between both again, that predecessor to the school district and the city of Eau Claire. So prior to that, I apologize, I don't know, how long this has been, quote, owned as joint ownership. I just know kind of what led to it being disconnected, both the city and the school district, back in 1982.
Second question,
Mr.
if I
Peterson,
may.
yes.
If the property does indeed get annexed to the city, would it come under county zoning or city ordinances?
It would come under city zoning and city ordinances, correct?
Okay,
Yes, so that's part of the process as well. And again, the recommendation then would be to P public zoning. So it would be a public zoning district, much like the other schools and other city facilities, parks, and so on.
thank you.
Commissioner Granlund.
I guess it's probably just because when we've done other annexations, there's been a mention of this distance to utilities, et cetera. I know that's not intended to develop a connection, but I was just curious in this case, is distance what it looks like all the way back to the city limit? That's disconnected or connected?
That is correct. It is disconnected from any public utilities owned by the city of Eau Claire. It's just over a mile, I believe, to the city boundaries, city limits currently. And again, there's no current plan to connect to city utilities, although it is in the sewer service area. So it is, would have future potential to have expansion of utilities. But right now, there's no interest or request for that.
Any more questions from the commission?
I should add as well, Mr. Chair, to add on to Mr. Peterson's last question as well, that in speaking with Mr. Ivory earlier as well, that, again, being subject to city ordinances. So if there are, an expansion or, electronic display, message display for a sign or those types of things, you would see that come forward if this annexation were to occur. So even though it is non-contiguous immediately to the city, it would still abide by those same ordinances, like any of the other schools would.
All right, thank you, Mr. Allen.
All right, thank you.
And the city is the petitioner, the
Correct. as
applicant on
as well,
this.
correct.
Is there a motion regarding item 1? Commissioner Peterson.
I'll make a motion to propose to annex it to the city.
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Wolfgram. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call a question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign? No. Okay. Thank you. And then we move directly to discussion and direction. We have one item to discuss, and that is multifamily design manual, progress on that. Mr. Allen, or Mr.
Oh,
Petrie.
sure. No, I can start us off. Thank you.
Okay.
Just real briefly, I'll turn it over to Ryan here real quickly. And then the three of us, Ryan, Pat, and myself, will walk through the attachment that's provided for you. But this was brought before you several months ago as a discussion item as well, real briefly to talk about multifamily design standards, particularly in the core neighborhoods of the city of Eau Claire. So we've had several public meetings, kind of interest meetings, kind of listening sessions with core neighborhoods as well as developers and builders who participate in those areas, and have worked through some draft additions, amendments to the current multifamily design manual that would apply to those areas. So before you tonight, we have some refined draft language that would be incorporated into the current manual, which was last updated in 2011. And so this is, again, I'll let kind of Ryan and Pat kick it off from there, in response to some of the feedback we've gotten from those neighborhoods to look at some more enhanced design standards, particularly related to the multifamily development in their neighborhoods. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Before you is a memo that was provided to the commission along with the potential guidelines that would be used for new development within the core neighborhoods. close proximity to downtown, including the East Side Hill, Historic Randall Park, Third Ward, North Riverfronts, Mount Washington, and West Riverside neighborhoods. This would only attain to new development within the core neighborhoods. Staff went over many guidelines, meeting with not only the neighborhood associations, developers, but also you, the Plan Commission, and staff review. More or less so, this would be incorporated into the multifamily design standard manual. Currently, those manuals standards mostly are for suburban Eau Claire and don't really incorporate what we would say is the core neighborhood principles and guidelines in design. So just running through the memo that was attached and the guidelines would be used to Plan Commission staff and developers when they are proposing a new development to make sure it is consistent with the existing neighborhood, the existing block. In older neighborhoods, you can have a mixture of single-family, two-family, 4 units, 6 units, 8 units, and so on, especially in the college district area. Staff would prefer to have more guidelines along with the Plan Commission for those reviews. So just walking through the bullet points for you, each of the staff members will tag team a few of them and highlight some points. This is just a draft, so if there's any questions, comments, just stop me or Pat or Scott going forward. We did do a presentation on November 5th and September 4th last year to the Plan Commission, but this is a lot more in detail. So just going through the first couple items, we would want to have consistent, compatible with the building heights and appearance to the existing neighborhood. Massing and materials would be similar or like to the existing neighborhood. More or less so, we don't want, for a duplex, we wouldn't want a 2-car garage or a 4-car garage facing the street. That would not be consistent with the existing core neighborhoods. It would be a good example of that. We would prefer rather have it, access off the alley if there is one, or similar like design features, just to touch base on one. Also, if the height elevation is, mostly 2 stories in the neighborhood, with the new development, we would prefer to be potentially 2 stories or at least 1 story with a dormer to make it feel taller and consistent with the existing neighborhood and block. Touching base on that as well, we would want to incorporate design features that each neighborhood would have. So going over that, the review criteria would be the first 4 are really touching base on the newer structure not being taller or not fitting within the neighborhood or within the block. Good example of that would be the 200 block of Chippewa Street. A few years back, JCAP Corporation proposed 4 units on that block. And they were taller structures, massing was more, density was more. The Plan Commission had a difficult time, along with staff and the developer, to meet certain standards. Now, you may or may not like that project, but as these neighborhoods get a little older in age, the removal of those properties, we all need to review it all as one development rather than just looking at individual development. Also, another second bullet point down would be the elevation of the first floor should be height similar to neighboring residents. As an architect, we were talking with architects and other people involved. They don't want the first floor elevation to be significantly higher. Now, I would remind you, in the core neighborhoods, there is some floodplain issues with that they do need to be higher than potential surrounding neighborhoods or surrounding block. But as long as it's consistent and compatible, that's what that one is. Number 3 bullet point would be the massing or scale and size of the front facing, not to exceed 125% of the largest structure. So for example, if you have a 35-foot wide home on that block, and that is the longest home facing the street, you could go not to exceed 125%, so that would be about 43.75 feet. That would be the maximum. That house could be as wide. Now, the setbacks would be 8 feet on the side, so even though we're saying the maximum is 35 right now, the new home could only be, 8 feet wider. And then touching base on that, the footprint of the area of the first floor shall not exceed 125 feet. So for example, if you have a 1,400 square foot footprint of that house, the new redevelopment house could only be 1,750. Now that's 350 square feet footprint wise. So total wise, if you did a 2-story, it'd be about 700 square feet wider. That's how we're addressing the massing and scale and compatibility with the surrounding homes along that block or within that neighborhood.
Ryan, can I just jump in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Just wanted to say that where we came up, you may be asking where we came up with the 125%. And what we did is we did some research from other communities in terms of what they've done for design guidelines. And La Crosse has done a pretty extensive job of developing guidelines for their older neighborhoods. And River City Architects out of La Crosse put together standards for the city of La Crosse. And these are the standards that they use. So we're basically pulling it from something that seems to be working to some extent in the city of La Crosse. So we didn't really just pull them out of the hat, but that's kind of where we, and they are, as Ryan mentioned, it's a guideline in terms of when we look at it, that it could vary one way or the other up from that 125%. We take a look at all these criteria in their entirety. We don't just necessarily zero in on one. We'll look at all of those, all of these criteria as we review a site plan.
Thank you, Pat. I think just having these standards not to exceed that now, if they do, they might have to set the building back farther or do some more kind of design guidelines that would be required by the Plan Commission staff and the developer. Going on to the next point, front-facing entranceway, no building should have more than 2. So if you're doing a 4-unit, you would have 2 doors or one common shared entry. A good example of that would be Mr. Mogensen's group did a 100 block of Niagara. They built 2 4-units that have a common entry into a shared hallway. Then the 4 units are divided off of that. Now with JCAP Corporation's 200 block of Chippewa Street, they have 4 doors facing the street. And here we're saying, unless it's a row home or townhome, we would be allowing 2 entries on single facade. So if it's facing the street, you'd be allowed 2 entry doors. Now you'd be having maybe 2 on the back or 2 on the side, but that's what that standard is. Now the Plan Commission staff and the developer can vary that, but that's what we're requiring. And then with that, the main entrance would have a roof covering at least 3 feet of the door. On some redevelopment sites, they don't even put any overhangs on. This would be for the front entrance. So if it was a corner lot and you had two fronts and then you had 2 entry doors, each one would be requiring to extend at least 3 feet over the door for the main entrance. The last one that I'm going to cover is with the front porches. They should be also including steps, overhangs, and the front porches should be at least 30% of the frontage. So a good example of that would be, again, the 200 block of Chippewa Street. They have about, I think I calculated 37% of the front coverage. It should be at least a porch for that structure. With that, that's what I'm covering. Is there any questions on the first page of review criteria that you see red flags or question marks or concerns or comments?
Commissioner Peterson.
On the last item on guiding principles, you talk about the latitude of acceptable design possibilities generally broader than a greater variety of housing styles exist in the area. How big is the area? Is it just that block or is it the entire neighborhood? Because when you get in the Randall Park neighborhood, you have some very big homes near Lake Street and the like, and then they get smaller as they go away from there. So it is just one block or?
Well, I think, yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I think using the third ward as an example, which has what makes the third ward unique is the variety of the housing styles within the neighborhood. So I think, and if you go down any one block, some blocks there might be some continuity within the design of that block, but typically there is quite a bit of variety. So I think we're looking at more of the neighborhood in that perspective in terms of since that particular neighborhood has quite a variety of housing styles. I think we would give the developer a little bit more latitude with that proposal if that neighborhood has that wider variety. We can, if you think we need to pin that down a little bit more in the verbiage here, we certainly can.
I think it comes under discretion. Again, you have to look what's in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things that comes up when you talk about going down where it should not have a 125% footprint larger than the largest structures on the block, or it shouldn't exceed 120% of the largest structure on the block. If it's in an area of the block where there's small one-story single-family homes, and at the other end of the block is 2- and 3-story homes, probably fit into the immediate area rather than on the block itself. And there could be one single-family small one-story home on a block and everything else is large, and if you can't be much different than the smallest one, that's going to have some problems also.
Yeah, actually what we're saying there, though, is that, for example, is you can't exceed 125% of the largest. So even if there is a smaller home on that block, what we would be looking at would be the larger of the homes on that block and then taking the 125%.
And when you talk about the main entrances and the porch should be at least 3 feet from the door, how wide? Are you looking just to cover the steps area, or is there any?
Actually, we'll be getting into the last criteria there, where the porches should extend along at least 30% of the frontage of the structure. And again, that would be the guideline.
But if it's just covering a door, there is no porch, there's just steps leading up there, you just need it as wide as the steps.
Correct.
And you're also stating new structures should be designed with an unenclosed front porch. What if they want an enclosed front porch, be it screening or storm end screens? Are they going to be allowed to do that?
That would be up to the discretion of the Plan Commission. Again, I think what we would take a look at is what the consistency of the other homes are on that block. If it's mostly open homes with open porches, I think it would be our recommendation you'd want to follow that design on that new building.
With my childhood home on Birch Street, both we and our neighbors had open front porches. The house I used to live in is now totally enclosed. That never comes back to the Plan Commission if they want to do a remodel and enclose an existing unenclosed porch, so. We get mosquitoes in this area, so it'd be nice to have screens sometimes. I'll wait till the second page, I have more comments.
Commissioner Wolfgram.
Thank you, Chairperson Larson. So I just prepared a few comments specifically regarding the broader guiding principles. So I hear you talking about this holistic approach to the guiding principles, holistic implying that the whole system of design needs to be considered and not driven by the individual parts. And this holistic approach is supported in the literature, but it's also inclusive of affordability and sustainability. So I would recommend, and I think it would be useful to add a guiding principle that would start with a holistic approach and integrating affordability and sustainability. The wording would be something like apply a holistic approach to the design, ensuring that affordability and sustainability will be considered in new or existing multifamily projects. Thank you.
Mr. Granlund?
If you don't mind my hinging on that same final, one of your guiding principles, I think although it is in fact a very difficult statement to prove untrue, because it's a true statement, I don't consider that it's an actual guiding principle. I think it might be more appropriate as part of the introductory paragraph above. That there is latitude there, it's that there isn't any guidance within that sentence. There is latitude, but it's not a principle of any kind. And then my other, like I said, I'm a little irritated by how detailed the review criteria are. They seem to demand compliance with a certain outcome, which I'm not sure will always fit a neighborhood. I think it fits our idea of a neighborhood, but I don't think it necessarily fits maybe neighborhoods where all of these criteria fail because the existing housing stock doesn't match this description. But that aside, just in the first item, I've been writing specification manuals for a long time. I never use any or all or some. So in that first line, I would say taller than the existing buildings on the block. If you say any of the existing, it could be taller than one or taller than all, or it actually, I said, it's just one of those things that from years I stick on that phrase. So I would get rid of any of in that first item. And I would really like more freedom as a designer to meet or to both as a designer and as a reviewer have more than just pass fail. Right now, that if it's more than 125%, it fails. Or I think there's more of a sliding scale of things that are more similar or less similar in many cases. But I can't come up with specific wording for anything else.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mr. Brennan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given this is design guidelines, I'm assuming that's why we're not addressing maintenance and upkeep expectations. Okay.
That's correct. And as Mr. Petrie noted earlier, this is simply for new construction.
Okay. Thank you.
Any more comments before we move on? Mr. Christopherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to, having recently canvassed in the Upper West Side, I keep seeing my neighborhood when you're talking this way, and I'm really grateful for some of the specificity. And I like the way that you're talking about maybe later on, how do you compile where the new construction matches or does not match? I mean, do you need to have a point value? But what I like about this particularly is the core neighborhoods. I live in just a bungalow, so it's 1-story, square box. I've got the little roof over the door. And just a block from me, the new construction is one of those garage in front, main door behind, like 4 feet between neighbors, and it just is jarring. And I really appreciate the insight that we can bring to new construction when we know that we have to backfill into those established neighborhoods. So there's probably a lot of conversation that's going to take us from where we are now to something that's easily used by a developer. But I think opening up the conversation and challenging for maybe a more variety or something, just challenging them to match something that's already built. Thank you for beginning this conversation.
Good. Thank you. Any more comments before we move on? Okay.
Okay. And on the second page, I'll go over some of those items. There's one more at the top of that page that relates to porches, and that porches should not be open between the ground and the floor. In other words, there should be some enclosure that should occur, either a lattice type of a material, or it could be a solid constructed with wood masonry or wood front. You'll see a number of homes in some of the older neighborhoods where there's been some retrofitting done on some of the porches, and they leave them basically open underneath, and it leaves somewhat of an unfinished look, I guess is what we're trying to get at in that situation. Then moving on, the next 4 bullet points relate to the roof of a building. The first one talks about the pitch of the roof, being that gable roofs, if that's what the design is, should be a pitch of 612 or steeper. If it were a hip roof, then it should be 412 or steeper. And then it goes on to basically kind of provide a little more of some flexibility, that this provision should not be construed to mean that all other roof types are not permitted. Again, as long as the roof pitch is appropriate for the architectural style of the building. And then again, looking back in terms of what some of the styles in that particular area or block would be. Then it indicates that flat roofs should be minimized or avoided. So it's not saying you can't have that, but generally speaking, a flat roof on a building in an area where you're having gable and hip roofs should be encouraged. Roof overhangs or eaves should extend from the wall a minimum of 18 inches on all elevations except for the front porches. Buildings that are single story should incorporate roof designs of higher eaves and steeper pitches to add visual height of the structure. And then the roof lines, especially where they are longer, so for example 35 feet to 40 feet, and that's just kind of an example, should incorporate design features such as gables, dormers, parapets possibly, to provide some variety and character in that structure. And then other decorative features would be encouraged, such as basically along the eave line in terms of brackets, barge boards, lintels, roof returns, and other decorative moldings below the eave line. So those 4 would relate more specifically to the roof. The following 2 then get into more window configuration. The first one is windows should generally have more of a vertical configuration rather than, what that's getting is rather than more than a square configuration or more of a horizontal orientation, so it should be more vertical. That's typically what you're seeing in some of the older homes. And then again, double hung windows would be preferable over casement or crank out type windows. The next one, these percentages here again, we went back and looked at what La Crosse had done. So these percentages come from what La Crosse has done in their older neighborhoods, in that at least 20% of the front-facing facade of a structure should consist of windows. Again, it's not saying shall, but should, so that would be something that we would take a look at to see when a development comes in, how close are they to that 20%? Are they just at 5%, or are they getting closer to that 20% guideline? And then on the side and rear-facing facades, they should have at least 10% window area. What we've seen in a lot of the newer construction is on some of the side elevations, they don't have any windows at all. So this would try to get at trying to encourage some window installation on the side elevations, particularly if it's on a corner lot. And then windows, doors, and corners should include trim that's at least 4 inches in width with contrasting color from the walls in order to add detail and character. Again, in looking at some of the newer construction, you'll see that the corners and the molding around the windows is either non-existent or very, very minimal. Typically in some of the older homes, the 4 inches is probably closer to the standard of what was constructed back at that time. And then lastly, shutters can complement the design of a building and should be considered where appropriate. So again, we're not requiring them, but we're putting that out there as a suggestion. The one thing that we've noticed a lot of times when shutters are applied, it's interesting to see if the historical perspective of a shutter was actually to actually close the window in case of a storm and things like that. But when you go out and look around at some shutters in some of the newer buildings, they don't even match the windows at all. So what we're saying here is that if you do install shutters, they should correspond with the dimensions and the height of the windows. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
All right. Thanks, Pat. The next section, next to final section, references landscaping, and then some of the material types, and then finally talking about garages and alternative energy options. So just moving on to landscaping. Obviously, landscaping is an important design element for new structures. Here we're looking at, again, trying to emphasize an actual landscape plan associated with these new buildings. So looking at a mix of both deciduous and evergreens. Plantings should include both those along the foundation and within the front and side yard areas. And variation in height of plantings is also necessary. So not just ground cover scattered throughout, but looking at some vertical and some horizontal variation in the landscaping as well. Landscaping should also be used to screen features such as egress windows, mechanical equipment, parking, and trash storage. I know we also talk about CPTED, which is the planning for, help me recall the acronym. Crime prevention. Thank you. Crime prevention through environmental design. Again, it's something that's been talked about here. Planning Commission a variety of times the last couple of years. So we're still taking that kind of concept into consideration with landscaping. So not just covering up everything as well, not going kind of the 180 the other direction. But again, looking at screening larger mechanical equipment, parking, trash storage, things that start to become a kind of almost like accessory uses related to these larger buildings or buildings with multiple units within them. Exterior materials should primarily be brick, wood, stucco, or a variety of engineered cement or fiberboard. This, along with the next one, had generated quite a bit of discussion over the meetings with, especially with developers and builders. Again, trying to provide for variety there, not to be exclusive of certain items, and again, trying to avoid some of the cheaper, less quality materials. And then with that, generally courses of brick along the foundation extending up 2 or 3 feet, what that looks like, should be avoided in structures primarily constructed with wood or smartboard siding exteriors to avoid a suburban look. The idea there is not every building type is going to be a nice base of brick or brick veneer, followed by siding above. There are some blocks, some neighborhoods where it is primarily wood structure, top to bottom, and that even though the brick may kind of look nice, perhaps provide a more enhanced visual feel, it's not necessarily compliant with the rest of that block or neighborhood. Structures, again, looking at solar energy in particular, structures should contemplate solar access and solar energy utilization for on-site and encouraged for electrical service supplied for hybrid and electric vehicles. That could probably be worded a little bit more simply, but we kind of played around with that a little bit. I got some feedback that we wanted to encourage some of that solar access, but not require that there be a provision that they must provide for solar energy installation or utilization on site, but provide for future installation if they do not provide that up front. And then also again try to provide electrical service for hybrid electrical vehicles, primarily electric vehicles of course, rather than again looking at that sustainability side of things as we've discussed already. Finally, again, looking at garages, so detached garages primarily. Vehicular access shall be from the rear if an alley is present. That's typically what's been happening. Again, some corner lots may have kind of a mix of that. If no alley is present, a garage facing a street shall, and there are 6 different items there, have similar exterior building materials as the house. Again, that's not uncommon. That's something we request or require elsewhere. Similar roof pitch. Again, Pat talked about the different roof pitches as well. Front wall setback, a minimum of 5 feet from the front elevation of the main structure, so it's not sticking out in front of the main building, or even at the same distance, but recessed a bit. Include windows of similar design as in the primary structure, so not being a windowless walls, as Pat was referencing with the windows on the main structure. Included 2 separate overhead doors for a 2-car garage. Again, not requiring a 2-car garage, but when there is a 2-car garage, that it be providing separate overhead doors around a large double door, more suburban nature. And then massing the detached garage should not exceed 50% of the primary structure. Again, that's a general design principle elsewhere. So with that, we have another set of items here Pat and I have laid out for your comments and questions at this point.
Commissioner Peterson.
On the fourth item on page 2, where it says buildings that are single-story should incorporate roof designs of higher eaves and steeper pitches to add visual height to the structure. The third guideline on the first page ensures that buildings are compatible with building height, appearance, scale of existing adjacent buildings. So if you have a 1-story ranch with a fairly flat roof, now we're saying that the 1-story house next door should have a steeper roof. And the first guiding principle said should be compatible with the building height and apparent scale of existing adjacent buildings. So they're kind of dichotomous.
I don't have a good answer for you. Maybe Pat does.
Well,
But,
maybe we'll have to delete that. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
we-
We'll have to take a look.
well, I think, again, yeah, we're looking at primarily single stories kind of, yeah, with blinders on a little bit. That if looking at a new single story in and of itself should have that kind of roof style. But you're referring to if it's kind of an infill lot mixed in with other single stories, it may
And
look
a
out of
roofs.
place with that. Sure.
Well,
maybe
yeah.
that's a qualifier we could add.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking, the more I think about it, again, is we would look at all of these criteria in an entirety, so that if there is a conflict between one or the other, that would be up to the commission to make that call. But I think the intent here is that if it is a single-story building, that, rather than having a 412 pitch roof, that they should be looking at a 612, similar to what the other criteria is, or maybe even a little bit higher, if that does fit in with the other buildings on the block. So it's just another factor to consider.
I'm just saying we have conflict between two
And
here.
that's possible.
And then down to the 6th item, windows should generally have more vertical configuration and be of double hung style. Double hung going to be required. I have crank windows, and I love crank windows. You can catch the breeze and bring it in there.
And that's up to the discretion of the plan commission, but typically in the older style homes, the double hung is generally the style that's used.
Maybe I'll have to travel, not only just the Randall Park neighborhood, but the East Side Hill too, and look at, West Side Hill. And the East Side Hill too. I'll look at both of them and see, if there's primarily double hung windows in there, because they have some drawbacks.
And I think too, and Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan as well, that I think is more the style be that way, not necessarily the operation per se, but would not have to have the sash and everything that operates the same. It could be
The only thing is with the crank out window, your design is gonna be different than a double hung. With a double hung, you have that, at least that middle sash there where the two windows are, whereas a crank out, it's basically one larger, piece of glass. So there is definitely a different design between the two.
Sometimes different is good. You know, I don't ever want to go into a neighborhood where if I have a couple of drinks, I don't know which house I'm going to because they all look alike. The next item, where you're saying should include trim at least 4 inches wide in width and a contrasting color from the walls in order to add detail and character. I can abide by that, and then 3 months later, I'd paint them the same color, if I wanted the same color. Oh. I don't know if contrast is good all the time. I have a brick front to my house. I have lap siding on the back and the 2 sides, and then my second story is Tudor. So I have 3 different facades on my house, and I think it looks pretty good. The other one is third from the bottom, generally courses of brick along the foundation extending up 2 or 3 feet should be avoided in structures primarily constructed of brick. What if they would like the entire front of the house to be brick and clapboard siding on the side?
That's fine. What we're specifically referring to there is where there would be primarily if it's a wood construction house and they put that lower 2 or 3 foot veneer from the ground up essentially, which is you'll see very commonly in the more the ranch style, suburban style homes. But if you wanted to have a completely masonry home, that'd be great. That's not a problem.
Because I have brick on each side of my garage. I have brick going up halfway, and then it's Tudor. The top half, the entrance to the house is all brick, and then the dining room is siding. So I have a variety there too. What is solar access?
Essentially, providing for future installation of solar panels and such, primarily on the structure, but it could be something off the structure as an accessory use per se, but providing for that opportunity in the future.
I think here maybe it's word usage. Access to most people is something where you go in and out, and it's not really an access. Maybe it's solar compatibility or solar convertibility, where they can add to it as opposed to access.
We're appreciating feedback on the word contemplate as well. We struggled with that one a little bit,
Okay.
thinking, it was consider, rather than just, straight provide for, but contemplate, meaning in your designs, provide for an opportunity for that in the future.
Then under garages, you had mentioned that you're generally talking about detached garages here as opposed to attached garages.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Because even with detached garages, if they're next to the house and let's say there's 2 or 3 foot walkway in between, with them being set back 5 feet, or 5 feet or more, now you have 5 feet or more. When you do snow removal, you can only go one direction. You can't shovel it towards the house. My garage extends out 4 feet beyond my house. A couple other neighbors do. If theirs is inset. They have to shovel all that snow in one direction, and it's a pain sometimes. One with include 2 separate overhead doors. Why are we looking at 2 separate overhead doors as to one large door?
Well, again, the large single overhead door is more of a suburban look, whereas in the older homes, typically with the garages, you'll find two 8-foot doors rather than one 16-foot door. That's kind of typical in the older neighborhoods. So it reflects more that feel than the suburban look.
I know of older neighborhoods that have one car garage with one door? And
But,
others?
yeah, let me just clarify, Mr. Peterson, this would also be only for duplexes and up, it wouldn't be for single family. So you typically on a duplex, you don't wanna have a two-car garage without the split down the middle. Otherwise, you'd be sharing a garage with a tenant you may or may not know. Or for a 4-unit, for example, too, you wouldn't want a shared garage that's just open. You would want to have a wall down the middle. Usually that's for a duplex mostly though. But this isn't applying to single family.
Okay, there are some condos and some
Okay.
high-end duplexes
Sure.
with two-car garages.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is just a guide, I guess, just to
Yeah.
clarify.
And with my double-wide garage door, I have a hard enough time watching one mirror backing out, let alone two at the same time. And when the wife and I switch vehicles, and I have a hard time backing out because I'm looking at the wrong mirror, so. But we're talking duplexes. All right, thank you.
Commissioner Granlund.
I think we should add some additional items here for marital guidelines. And mirror placement, but no. I was going to say that with the solar access, that also is a consideration of the neighbor's solar access, and that also would fall in line with the general height of the building and spacing of the building, to be aware of the adjacent solar access. While you're building your own solar panels, that's great. It's also nice not to be shading someone else's solar panels the whole time. And I think that was what I ended up with, other than, instead of saying 2 doors for two-car garage, you could just indicate that each parking stall should have its own access door. Would make it a little bit more universally stated.
Greg,
Each parking stall within the garage would have its own access door. Would be an easier way to avoid the counting over and over again.
Thank you. Any other comments? Commissioner Wolfgram.
Chairperson Larson, during both discussions, did the neighborhood associations express any concern about lack of variation or freedom in design? Examples we spoke of here, porches, windows. Was there any feedback from the neighbors at all about that? Or any concern about lack of freedom or variation?
Well, I think the one comment related to the one, we had the guiding principle in terms of the latitude of acceptable design possibilities, generally broader with the greater variety of housing that exists in an area. So I think that comment came through, is that it was important to look at the neighborhoods and see if there was a variety of design going on, that we should encourage that flexibility. So that kind of came through.
And maybe to add to that point, so if we do get a new proposal, if these are adopted by Plan Commission and Council, if a proposal did come forward, it would first go to the neighborhood association, if there is one. Now, if there isn't one that's active, then it would go to staff review first, and then we would work with the neighborhood association and the developer and come up with, see how many guidelines they actually met, and then bring that forward to the Plan Commission. Now, if the Plan Commission decides they want to postpone the item and should make suggestions off of that, that would be happening at that time, at this meeting, in front of the developer. And then he would go back to revisions, and then that site plan would come forward, or back to the Plan Commission at a later date. But the neighborhood association would be directly involved with the review, and they would either provide written documentation or have somebody at the meeting presenting on behalf of the neighborhood association.
It's very helpful, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Christopherson. I was just checking my next
Thank you,
one.
Mr. President. I would like to ask a similar question. What kind of conversation did the developers have when they're seeing these kinds of guidelines? Because it doesn't sound like this is really what is being built in some of the core neighborhoods. How did they react to the?
Yeah, I think we got some mixed responses from the developers. I think there were some that did have some concerns about this, that they felt that some of these things were going to possibly increase the cost, possibly. They were looking at more of the bottom line versus design, I guess, in some cases. Kind of that fine line between those two issues.
Oh, no.
Follow-up question.
Yes.
Is there a possibility that there could be an additional conversation looking for something that might lessen that gap? In my conversations, I've understood that garage out front is much less expensive to build. And I was, in the conversation, I was sensing that there's some real resistance to moving to something that's more traditional.
I'll defer to Pat and Ryan a little bit on the last meeting, but yeah, we're certainly open to additional modifications to some of this, but I think we've gotten pretty good feedback from the builders and developers, and if anything, short here, we try to call out some of those sections that have been modified with those discussions, again, that we had with them. So, some of those were really did inform a lot of these different modifications here. So I've not heard anything more specific. That's why, again, deferring to Ryan or Pat, specifically saying, oh, you can include all these, but don't include these 4 in this list. I think they're all pretty well agreeable.
I would add too, some of the new development that has occurred has already met most of these standards, not all of them, but they have met most. Good example would be Mogensen's duplex that's in the 200 block of Chippewa. It is all brick. It does have the larger dormer. It has the larger windows. It also has the porch on the front, and that is a duplex that looks like a single family. Now, some other ones that have occurred, there's J-caps along the 200 and 300 block of Chippewa. Those are the ones that kind of meet the standards, but may not meet the standards. They do the windows, they do the larger porch, but they also add the brick on the front. Is it compatible and consistent with the neighborhood, with the height and the massing and the density? And I know the Plan Commission, that was 3 years ago, had a difficult time with that entire project. So this would be leveling the play field for not only the Plan Commission, but also the neighborhood and the developers. Now, in the end, it is the Plan Commission's determination, and that's where the power of you in front of you for each development. So if a duplex does come forward and it meets 2 of the standards out of the 22 we have, the Plan Commission may say we don't accept that, or we do with the conditions that this occurs. So some developers are doing it, some don't do it, and in the end, I think staff and the city would prefer these structures to be there for 50 to 100 years. So the quality of products that we would like to see should meet some of these guidelines. Now, obviously, each project won't meet all of the guidelines, and that's where the Plan Commission needs to be the balancing act between what is good design and good development for core neighborhoods.
I think I can give a little bit of perspective on that too, because a few years ago we reviewed our comprehensive plan for the city, and we brought together a committee of developers and real estate folks and people interested in sustainability and design and stuff like that. And we had a consultant, and one of the comments I remember him making is, we should tame the garage. And somebody said, well, what do you mean by taming the garage? And he talked about neighborhoods where the garages are the prominent feature on the front of the house, you know, and it'd be rows of houses like this. And one of the developers said, well, I mean, that's what the market is looking for now because it's cheaper to build. And people can get more square footage and things like that. But what it comes down to really is in that process that the committee decided that one of our top goals in this next cycle of planning is to revitalize and restore and preserve the aesthetic integrity of our older neighborhoods in the inner part of the city. And so so it really does come down to the Plan Commission looking at these things. I mean, these are guidelines that can give developers an idea of what we're looking for in those neighborhoods, but it really does come down to us looking at seeking input from neighborhood associations and looking at developments. And we have turned some down, you know. People sometimes aren't happy about that, but this is what our community wants. So. Any other comments? Commissioner Seymour.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud. I guess my question is, one of the problems I think we ran into with some of that JCAP stuff was they were combining lots in order to, I guess, build those big buildings.
That was one that was turned down actually on First Avenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is that handled in this, or is that a different subject matter in a different book, where we can maybe control that combining of tearing down 3 or 4 houses to build one large building?
As Mr. Petrie puts that together, yeah, as he mentioned before, I think this is intended to address some of that, especially the massing recommendations we have up front. I'll let Ryan drill down a little deeper here.
It just so happens I came prepared for that question. I thought somebody would ask it, but more or less so, what Mr. Seymour is talking about is this block right here. So they took out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 houses. This aerial is from 2013. This is from 2018, and you can see he replaced that with four units. Now, the Plan Commission, again, I mentioned this was approved 3 years ago. I was at each of the discussions that the Plan Commission held. They had a very difficult time with that approval. More or less so, he would not be meeting the massing or scale of the front-facing facade. I ran some numbers before the meeting this afternoon. His building is 54 feet long, and if you did the 125%, the longest building on that block was 35 feet. So he would only be able to go 43, 44 feet. That'd be up to 125%. He went up to almost 175%, give or take. Footprint-wise, on the largest structure that was there, a different map was 1,400 square feet. 125% of that is 1,750 for the footprint. His minimum footprint is 2,250, so that's 400 square feet larger per floor. And that's the smallest one, which is on the corner here. Also, the tallest building, according to Google Maps, which isn't the most accurate, but is 33 to the peak, and that is on the corner, right here. His tallest is to the peak is 39 feet, so 6 feet taller. So that would have been the standards. Now he does do the front facing porches. He does the larger windows. He does the larger trim. But is that consistent, compatible with density, massing? And that's the conversation that we're having. He would not meet the massing and scaling of front facing. He would not meet the footprint area. He's well over 125%. Now, we would bring all the facts forward to the Plan Commission and note he would be 175% over that, for example. And then the Plan Commission would say, no, you need to narrow it down to no more than 125% or compromise in between.
I got a follow-up.
Yes,
Thank you.
Commissioner Seymour.
So that brings me back to, under the review criteria, the first bullet point, the height of the new structure should not be noticeably taller than any of the existing buildings on the block. And I think block is important. I know we touched on this earlier with Mr. Peterson, but what JCAP argued at that time, and with some authority or whatever, was that they took the neighborhood as a whole and they found a few large mansions and they used that as a, you know, their argument that, well, this fits into the neighborhood because there are a few large buildings like that. So I guess I'm looking for a little clarification, and I guess I didn't get that when you talked about it earlier with Mr. Peterson. Are we looking at the block itself that the development is happening on, or are we taking the neighborhood as a whole and using that as the gauge?
Both.
Yes, exactly. I was gonna say the same.
Depends.
We tried to make it more specific to the block, like Ryan was mentioning these massing recommendations, the review criteria we do talk about on the block, you know, within the block. So we're trying to be specific to the block in those situations. The rest, as we were saying, is a little bit more broad, as Pat was saying, more broad to the overall neighborhood.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about architectural design, whether it's a bungalow versus a Cape Cod or something like that, there we're looking more neighborhood-wise. But I think as Scott mentioned, when you're talking specific size, we're narrowing it down more to the block there.
Good, I think that's a good thing. And I have one more question, and then I'll close it out. What are we looking at in terms of time frame for wrapping this up and getting it into the books?
Oh, we talked about this question too. Who was going to answer this, Ryan?
Well,
No,
Mr. Allen.
I think we wanted direction from the commission tonight in terms of if we're on the right track, we can do one or two things. We can come back with some revisions based on what we're hearing tonight, or if you think we're in pretty good position, we could go ahead and proceed with the public hearing in terms of scheduling that over the next couple months or so. So we're kind of looking for direction from you in terms of where you think we're at with this.
I guess if I could say one more thing, I think it's important that we kind of move quickly on this. I'm seeing some things go up that I'm not exactly on board with, and I think it would be wise to, not to rush this along. I think it should be done correctly, but I'd like to see it pushed along as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Peterson?
Yeah, a couple of things. Leave that up, I'm gonna get back to that. In the northwest corner of 8th and Chippewa is a single-family home, one story. West of there is a two-story house. West of there is a one-story house, and then there's two-story houses. If that middle one-story house were to be replaced with a duplex, they go 2 stories? in that the buildings on each side of them would be 2 stories, but the house on the corner is only 1 story, according to these criteria. And in a similar vein, if the next 2 lots east of those 4 buildings were to be purchased and a multi-family dwelling go in there, they'd be the same, do they put in the same scale as the 4 buildings to the east, or do they have to worry about the 1 building to the west?
I think that's a good scenario where definitely would have to take into account all of the provisions. I think that's, again, not to give you a non-answer, but to say it really is context dependent and depends on the project. As Ryan was inferring, if these projects, for example, came forward now, we'd recommend them based on they meet the review criteria, but if the massing was perhaps the only issue and everything else was met, that's up to the planning commission to say we're okay with 95% of this, even though the massing may be not our preferred. So that's where I kind of, again, not to give you a non-answer, but to say that's one of the criteria that you need to consider. If that's the most important, because you look at the scale of that block, then the rest, you're right, the rest kind of drop down the list of importance. So we didn't want to weight these one way or the other. That's where we kind of just gave you a big long list, but we tried to break them out by kind of type a bit. So when we reframe this and kind of reformat it, you'll see in these different categories, and you may have differing preferences that, landscaping is more important because this block has, mature landscaping. It's very important. And when you wipe out 2 lots next to each other, boy, landscaping is going to be a bigger issue than how tall the building is. So again, not to give a non-answer, but to say it's going to be very context dependent. So I may even turn the question back and say, what would you think about that? Would that be okay to have a taller building, or is it more important to have the material type and the front facade and the porch match more than the height? So.
If I can get back to the garage doors. If I were to tear down a house on an existing lot in one of the older neighborhoods, wanted to build a single-family dwelling, I'm off the alley with my garage, I can put up 1 2-car garage door. But if I wanted to put a duplex on that lot, and a lot of times both the husband and wife work, and it's nice to have 1 door for each garage, and so you have 2 stalls per duplex, we're going to require them to put in 4 garage doors rather than 2 stall garage doors, because they're multifamily.
Well, again, it could be one of the criteria that you're looking at. The criteria says that we should consider it. You'd look at each situation on a case-by-case basis, and if it's the staff's feeling in our staff report, if we feel it's appropriate that they should have individual doors, that's what we would be recommending. And that would be up to the commission to either agree or disagree with us.
But the word used here is, if no alley is present, a garage facing a street shall. That doesn't mean there's an option. It shall have 2 garage doors. So if you let's say you came off the street and you had the garage on the outside of the duplex, this says it shall have 2 single garage doors for a 2-stall garage.
Well, again, the intent of the guidelines is, based on the direction we've gotten from the comprehensive plan, is to try to blend in the newer development with the older development. And what we're suggesting tonight is that the single-car garage doors blends in more than having the 1 larger door. I guess if you disagree with us, then we should make that change now. But it's our feeling that blends in more with the older development.
Maybe it's in that those older neighborhoods were developed at the latest, the 30s and 40s, where there was 1 vehicle. To a household, they had 1-stall garages and a single-stall garage door. So if like me, I like a double-wide door, I shouldn't build in those old neighborhoods. Maybe that's what it comes down to. If I don't meet the criteria, don't build there.
All right, Joe?
Commissioner Granlund.
Okay.
I think one element we're overlooking with having a guideline that's published is that the developer can come with their list of their intended compliance and non-compliance, their intended comparison, so that they can say, well, in this block, this, and this are true, and everyone else is a single garage door, why not do it that way too? I think that's, we're looking at it as our own guideline for what we decide, or what the guideline for the administrative staff to use in the office, but actually is also meant to allow a contractor or a developer to prepare their argument. When they come in and say, well, this is, I believe this, okay, that doesn't do number 3 at all, but 6, 7, and 8 are right on the dot, and for a developer to know that certain things have already been traded allows them to develop that argument. I'm doing a garage door that's big because that's what the market demands beyond this the one item out of 20.
Right.
Keep in mind how long a list this is, and you can't match this whole list.
Right, thank you. Commissioner Brenholm.
Yeah, and I concur with Commissioner Granlund. I think it's important that we remember these are guidelines, they're not commandments. And there's supposedly, it's going to give the developer a good, I think you stated it well, it gives them a guideline and gives them an opportunity to prepare a case before this commission to either approve or disapprove the site plan. And one other thing, to Mr. Allen's point, as far as what next steps are in that, I agree with Commissioner Seymour in that we need to move forward on this. And I think taking all of this input and then scheduling a public hearing is going to be more expeditious than you coming back to us with version whatever, and we beat that up a little bit more, and then we have to decide whether we're going to do a public hearing. I think we need to go to a public hearing, and then you base any revisions on the input you get there as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Christopherson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am feeling the presence of Commissioner Gregor, who is not with us today, but he has said several times about how much space we develop and dedicate to our vehicles. And it might be interesting if there could be some verbiage in these that just refers to not spending so much time parking our vehicles and using our limited space on vehicles when we could be having a bicycle or something else. I just think there's a lot of advantages to thinking differently in ways that we used to live without 3 cars, and now you have, all kinds of vehicles parked. But I think we could create space for people that don't really want to have a 2 or 3 car garage.
Mr. Peterson.
Do they have to have separate doors for each bicycle?
Yes.
I'm being facetious there. But Gregory brought up guidelines. This says criteria. Criteria, to me, leans more towards rules. That these aren't guidelines, these are criteria, these are rules. But we're looking at more at guidelines with some wiggle room in here then.
Well, I think, if I may respond to that, I think what decides what these actually are and what the enforcement ability of these guidelines is where they're published. If this was an ordinance, we'd be talking about rules and that are enforceable. what I see this is, and I agree with Commissioner Granlund when he said that the latitude of acceptable design possibilities is generally broader, would be better placed in the top paragraph, maybe just before where it says, based on these guidelines, the Plan Commission will make the final determination. And there are some words like shall and any that maybe should be modified, but what I see this as, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of a preemptive communication to the development community. This is what we're looking for in terms of multi-family dwellings in these specific neighborhoods, because we want to preserve the integrity of the aesthetic value of these neighborhoods. We want to keep the vintage sort of look in this neighborhood. And it's important to us. We learned that in the plan, as I discussed earlier, we learned in our comprehensive plan review that it was important to our neighborhoods, it was important to our community, and we have followed that sort of broad mandate, if you would call it that, since then. And we've, as we said, we've turned down some plans that we felt didn't match that that goal of ours. So this is not the authority of it comes from how it's published and how it's communicated. It's not an ordinance. It's a guidebook. It's sort of telling the developers, this is what we're looking for. But keep in mind that the latitude of acceptable possibilities is generally broader, and that the Plan Commission makes the final decision.
I just think we have to be careful when we use the word guidelines, the word criteria, because they mean different things to different people.
Sure.
And I know, pretty sure there's a legal definition of the word shall. And shall is almost absolute. You know, and a lot of these developers do have legal contacts or lawyers they consult, and you know, if shall isn't in there, they're going to get around it. Or
It was our intent when we drafted these, is most of them were supposed to be should. And when we talked about the garages, I think that should be a should rather than a shall.
I think because there is such a mixture of houses, especially in the Randall Park neighborhood, and I don't know the west side as well, that a home that wouldn't fit in one block might fit on another. You know, and that's where, when we talk about housing styles exist in an area, I think the term area has to be defined fairly well.
Thank
Just want
you.
to make sure we're not backing ourselves into a corner where we're going to get
Right.
trouble.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Seeing none, I will ask if we have any code compliance items. Any future agenda items we should talk about? And finally, any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none and without objection, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you for
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the City of Eau Claire. A transcript of this meeting is available for the hearing impaired. It will be available within 7 days of this telecast. Call 715-839-4912 or TDD 715-839-1689 or write Eau Claire City Clerk, P.O. Box 5148, Eau Claire, Wisconsin 54702-5148. Newsworks is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, please contact us via phone at 715-839-5067 or online at valleymediaworks.org.